So what is it that actually will drive this speciation event? Well, if you wanted to look at a big population, okay, or any population, and you split that population geographically, isolated them by habitat, isolated them by times of the day that they breed, whatever, splitting that population, what we have to think about is what will make speciation happen faster. As with all evolution, speciation events are slow. So what could we do to make them faster? Well, we can look at a couple of different examples. There are many examples in your book and in fields of biology looking at geographical divides. So in this case, salamanders around the Central Valley. The most ancestral populations are in the north. As they split and went down the Central Valley, some stayed inland, which is much drier. Some went to the coast, which is a much more wet environment. And now when they've recombined, the populations have come back together in the south, they're actually two species now. Now, imagine a salamander walking the length of California. This is not a fast process. These two species did not develop overnight. This took many, many generations, and the selection, the natural selection that occurred here was driven by climate, so driven by environment. We talked before that if you're going to select for particular alleles, we select for them based on environment and what drives that phenotype. This is something known as allopatric speciation, so a population divided by geographical barriers. Because of this geographical divide, here are my squirrels on the north and south rim of the Grand Canyon. They have been separated long enough that they are now considered two species. You can put these squirrels together, they are not going to mate. They have no interest in one another. They don't recognize each other, but ancestrally they were the same species. So this allopatric speciation suggests under all conditions, not just terrestrial, we can look at aquatic conditions. The Isthmus of Panama actually has separated 15 species now of snapping shrimp. They all have one ancestral species. So they all started out with one population, and that population was split and has now become 15 different species. This really drives evolution and speciation in small and isolated populations. We would not see allopatric speciation in the human population. We are not governed by geographical divides. You can get on a plane and go wherever you want, right? You are not limited in that regard, but small isolated populations certainly are. Sympatric speciation, on the other hand, is a weird one, and we can't get all ecologists to actually agree on this one because the populations still live in the same geographical area, but something else has separated them, either by call, by display, looking at simply some individuals who are more likely to breed than others, so looking at like an intrasexual competition sort of division. This is a weird one because these species could mate if they were at the same place at the same time and had the same opportunities. The target example for this one is actually the hawthorn fruit fly. Now, what they are looking at is the hawthorn fruit fly may have divided from the apple fruit fly. And the reason that they're different is not because of anything structurally. They could mate. What divides them is the timing of hatch. So fruit flies hatch, right, from eggs. But what they looked at is that hawthorn flies have actually become what they're calling a separate species because they hatch out earlier in the year and eat hawthorn berries, as opposed to the flies that essentially sleep in, hatch later in the season, and feed on apples. Well, it's not that these two flies could not mate. They can. You can mate a hawthorn fly to an apple fruit fly and they will mate just fine. The problem is this temporal barrier. So they're separated by time. So is that really speciation? Some people say yes. Some people say no. In this whole idea of rapid speciation events, we can look to this idea of polyploidy. So you are a diploid organism, right? You're 2N. Polyploidy is anything more than 2N. In you, this does not work. We can't have humans with more than 2 copies of chromosomes. There are exceptions with trisomy 21, but that leads to Down syndrome. There are a few other chromosomes that could be in multiple copies, but you would not survive as a 3N organism. Okay, won't happen. 4N, no way. But other species can, particularly plants. We see this a lot in plants. But what we look for is that these polyploids arose from some sort of hybridization event, and that hybridization actually forms this hybrid offspring, but most of the time this hybrid is actually sterile. So like we saw with the mules and the zorses. Our concern is over time the chromosomes in a hybridization event don't actually pair up. So there's no pairing of the chromosomes in a hybrid. Instead, what we see is this kind of mix of chromosomes, and we end up with in some cases, a sterile hybrid. They could reproduce asexually, but they wouldn't reproduce sexually, as opposed to a hybrid that would actually be viable, has a nice pairing of chromosomes. Let me show you what I mean. So we can take these hybrid species, okay? So our hybrid flower over here, our iris, beautiful, okay? It's formed by a cross of these 2 parental species. This hybrid species is fertile only if you can back cross it to a parent species. Now this is not cross it to its actual parent. Okay, so if we could actually take this species of this hybrid and cross it with one of these parental species, and you would get offspring. You would get viable offspring from those crosses. But you cannot asexually cross this hybrid to itself. You can't cross it to another hybrid of the same species. So what we look for then is this ability of the chromosomes to kind of be jumbled up and realign and give us these opportunities for hybridization. Hybrid species lead to very, very fast speciation events because this is a unique species. It's different from its 2 parents. This is a speciation event in a single generation. The problem is, by our definition of species, it has to be able to interbreed, and that it can't do. So we have to be careful with these terms.